Welcome to this next lecture on everyday bordering. And you can see here I've outlined the three key aims of the lecture: to explore what we mean by everyday bordering, to consider how we might theorise everyday bordering by drawing on the sociological literature, and to consider some of the effects of bordering on everyday lives. The first task is to pause and to go to these two key readings by Newman and Rumford that are on the online reading list. And I'd like you to reflect on the following questions and bring your notes to class. So really thinking about the readings and the course material covered so far. So moving on to this idea of the technology of everyday bordering, and arguably this is of increasing significance because border enforcement roles are being outsourced to private companies. So for example, G4S, Serco, to landlords, to employers. Public servants too are increasingly forced into these what we could call border enforcement roles: teachers, lecturers, social workers, health workers and more. People are facing ranges of discrimination and intimidation and harassment when trying to rent a flat, open a bank account, visit a doctor, go to college or work, places of worship, using public transport or simply walking on the street, just because they are suspected of not having the correct immigration papers. And for those who do not have the correct papers or who are in the process of applying, often find themselves denied access to justice and the most basic of human rights. So they could be picked up with no notice, held indefinitely in a detention centre, or face removal with little or no legal aid to contest. So really what this comes down to is being monitored all the time, but the hostile environment, as we've seen in other lectures, affects us all and is arguably at the core of threatening what has been described as the conviviality of multicultural Britain in general. Conviviality here in the sense of cohabitation. And this monitoring, as we know, is historically grounded in immigration legislation, where surveillance as part of a particular form of technology prevails and has done for decades. But it is increased, it is more overt, and these types of everyday surveillance technologies feeds this noble lie of something being done. It's also big business. Everyday bordering and everyday technologies, the technologies of everyday bordering, target people who have political clout, employers and landlords and so forth. There's a lot of business and revenue for the state, which this is generating. People are required to pay huge fines if they're found not to have played their role as border guards properly. For example, haulage companies are charged £2,000 for each clandestine entrant they carry, and the vehicle's driver, owner or hirer can be fined. So what do we mean by bordering and ordering chaos? Well, the borders that are physical, traditionally now arguably exist alongside everyday bordering practices, which create new types of social cultural divisions that are also spatial as well as symbolic. And this really requires a more critical engagement with the idea of the essence of borders that can be found in their, as the quote says here, taken for granted mappability. Actually, this is about representation. A door can be a border for some, but it can stop others passing through. A wall can sign both protection and a political offence. We don't live necessarily in those times that are deterritorialised, and on the contrary, borders and order has been increased and contributes to who and what is included and excluded. They are inherently ambiguous, pose between openness and closure, inclusion and exclusion, fear and desire, security and insecurity. And it's important again to remember this does not happen on a level playing field. So not everyone experiences borders in the same way. Some are much more comfortable with borders than others, and not everyone sees borders in the same way. And the metaphor that Rumford uses of a firewall, I think, is helpful because borders perform a kind of intelligence filtering. They point to borders being designed to allow the passage of desirables while keeping undesirables out. And these firewalls are used as a way to differentiate between the good citizen and the unwanted. So how are borders demarcated? Well, according to Newman, the process through which borders are demarcated is critical to our understanding of how borders are managed and the extent to which they are permeable to movement. Demarcation here relates to those kind of lines in the sands and the fences and the walls, but also rules and regulations which determine the existence of difference in the first place. And the borders within such differences are also enclosed. These are not fixed or hard. All borders are, arguably, social constructions, delimited and demarcated by people, although there are specific benchmarks that conveniently allow us a cut-off point, ones we don't always see, but we know they exist. Geographic regions have mountains and rivers and deserts. Municipal areas have cities with rail lines and public buildings. And society has age groups, race, gender, religion, economic status, all act as cut-off points and lines of demarcation. And we can also see different types of borders existing in the same space. Some are retained to assert differences, others are removed to promote better integration, and others again are enforced to assert exclusion. And what's important here is that there is a hierarchical nature of borders and boundaries, so they can be hidden and also hierarchical. Then there is this idea of remote control, of duties being carried out by civil servants, immigration officers, police, consulate officials, but also haulage carriers, security agencies, travel agents, hotel personnel, employers, local social services, all urged to reach deep and uncover undocumented foreigners and deter asylum seekers. And this is carried out by offshore databases and centres. In airports, we see the use of the biometric border. And actually, what we're seeing is a radical transformation of border landscapes. Remote control, this idea of remote control, this disaggregation of border functions, is intrinsic to border control because the state simply cannot be omnipresent. Meanwhile, people seeking asylum, for example, face ever more insidious forms of social controls on a daily basis. So these are not exceptional, and these include things like immigration enforcement officers on public transport and regulations within housing. This image is an example of a poster in a Serco-run accommodation facility where residents had been told they would be reported to the Home Office for leaving bedroom doors open that could be a fire hazard. In this way, everyday actions become border offences. So I'd like you now to pause and watch this film, and I'll post the clip on Moodle. And the film is Everyday Borders, and I'd like you to watch the film and reflect on these questions. So what might be the effects of everyday bordering? Well, what we see is a major shift away from an exclusive and primary concern with conventional nation-state borders, so the external edges of a polity, to a concern with borders being dispersed throughout society and found wherever the movement of information, people and things is happening and is controlled. The move towards the study of such diffused borders has been partially offset by the preoccupation with securitization and surveillance in a post-9/11 context. The resultant and somewhat contradictory dynamics of contemporary border studies means that even national borders, which once had geographical locations, however arbitrary, now appear in airports distant from the edge of the territory, and more significantly in databases that may not even be in the country in question. And it's important to note that this is not just experienced by people targeted, but also by those on the edges and everyone in the vicinity. It contributes to the development of a tiered society where frontline staff, ill-informed and unaware of patients or service user rights, but also patients are unaware. And so we have situations of staff turning people away despite full rights and entitlement of access to care. And this has effects where we have a significantly greater cost for health systems, where patients who are turned away from accessing everyday healthcare turn to overstretched accident and emergency. So forcing people into crisis mode actually means more pressure on the public purse. And this, as we know, is underpinned by rhetoric that vilifies migrants as health tourists, for example, although there is no evidence of this actually existing. But this creates a notional border that migrants are responsible for the state of the NHS in the UK. And consequently, this creates tiers of society with different levels of access to public services. And this results in tiered services, much of which will depend on knowledge of frontline staff. And this will be based on immigration status and ethnic classifications. So what happens is those who do not appear to be white British face questions. Others are much less significantly asked. And I think this brings us nicely to the question of domopolitics. And I would like you to pause and read Walter's article on this. Again, it's in the online reading list. Domopolitics employs the rhetoric of homeland and security to sanction exceptional measures in the name of a particular conception of home. As he writes, the uses and meanings of home has, and we can see here in this quote, powerful affinities with family, intimacy and place. The home is hearth, a refuge or a sanctuary in a heartless world. The UK is caught then between a desire to embrace flows of mobility for economic advantage and a desire to control and order such flows ever more minutely. In doing so, we witness the production of a particular politics of mobility, whose dream is not to arrest mobility but to tame it, not to build walls but systems capable of utilising mobilities, tapping their energies, and in certain cases deploying them against the sedentary and ossified elements within society. Walter uses the term to refer to policies and practices which aim to govern the state as a home, as a domos, with heads of state or governments akin to traditional patriarchal father figures running the state as if it were a household. So this trend to treat outsiders as invaders who threaten the peace, stability and normalcy of one's home. Whilst there are exceptions, those invited are welcomed and even adopted. And this takes us to a second articulation of the word domos that Walter suggests, that of seeking to tame and domesticate those forces seen to threaten such a homely image, as domos comes to denote a will to conquest, tame and subdue. Some examples of this might be the Gateway Protection Programme and the latest reincarnation of that, the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme, both programmes for quota refugees, a direct manifestation of this will to domesticate. These programmes are about providing a screened, checked and legitimate route into the UK, which the Home Office envisaged and put into place in contrast to the more complex, and the subtext here would be disorderly, chaotic, uncertain, uninvited issues associated with dispersed asylum seekers. So this is presented as a legal route for genuinely deserving cases, and it goes hand in hand with tough action that the Home Office has taken to stop abuse of a system by those who are not genuine refugees. These quota programmes are about filtering, selection and identification of those seen to be acceptable, thus genuine, deserving, orderly, certain and invited. They are presented as a safe and positive outcome of a domopolitical system of decision making. So quota schemes become moral and political, and the regulation of people via such schemes provides vital insights into the contemporary domopolitics in the UK. And if we return to this question of home, the home serves as a metaphor for both the national economy and the national territory. Its familiarity and ordinariness, conceptually, give it a powerful moral and emotional appeal. It also has a particular salience within the austerity context, in terms of an acceptance of the inevitability and necessity of cuts, and also as marking out who deserves the scarce and shrinking resources of the welfare state, whose needs should be prioritised, and who is seen to be a burden on stretched public finances. Poverty then comes to be outsourced to migrants. And the most recent Immigration Act marks a return to the language of the 90s, pitting the desiring against the deserving. This Act works harder than previous attempts at taming or curbing this threat. Introduction of healthcare charges, in some cases hospital care charges, the requirement of DVLA staff, banking staff and landlords to be responsible for checking immigration status. Through an austerity lens, these measures seem rational, needed, common sense even, because they're about protecting the resources of home. Borders are no longer what or where they used to be, and these tactics mark the border control creep into the everyday, and the home and its ordinariness and its normalcy is a perfect platform for the rationale for this immigration and border control creep. And service providers are working both on behalf of and independent of the state. People are conscripted as border guards in bordering activities in a range of settings. This arises from a politics of everyday fear. If states cannot provide security, if they cannot keep the domos safe, if borders are porous, then people become obsessed with the security of the domos, of their borders. And I'd like you to pause here and read this article about Tapiwa Matakutiri, who was arrested and pinned to the ground in his home by immigration officers acting on a false tip-off from the DVLA. And I'd like you to reflect on these questions about how we might connect this to Doma politics. And I'd also like you to pause and reflect on this set of questions for discussion, on what I've covered already in the lecture and in the readings, and think about the ways in which we talk about bordering in relation to race and stigma and social segregation. How we can think through the binaries that we find problematic through the lens of bordering, the ways that the diversification of migration, so as you've covered in the course so far, helps us either understand bordering or engage with its usefulness as a concept, and thinking carefully through the relationship between the bordering and everyday interactions. So bordering occurs in the UK within the context of the hostile environment, and this approach extends immigration controls beyond the obvious to a range of areas of everyday life. And if we analyse this through these three different operations, we can focus on three core themes: information, criminalisation and collaboration between the Home Office, the Border Enforcement Agency, policy, the police and the public. Information here relates to many of the new measures involving ramping up of data collection and data sharing between the Home Office and its partners, in inverted commas. Intelligence systems typically rely on low-grade tip-offs from members of the public, and access to personal details collected by banks and schools and doctors, homelessness charities are a big boost to the Home Office's ability to track and arrest so-called illegals. Criminalisation relates to this idea of just trying to live without the correct documents becoming a crime. So, for example, renting a home to somebody who's illegal can now lead to prison sentences of up to 5 years. So we have seen an introduction of harsher penalties, automatic evictions, freezing of bank accounts that can hit anyone without the right to remain. And the third is this theme of collaboration, where control is outsourced from the Home Office to other government agencies. Let's look at 3 examples here that we can understand through looking at information, criminalisation and collaboration. The first is Operation Vacan, which was developed to test this idea that people without leave to remain would depart voluntarily if they were made of these 3 points. This pilot took place in July and August in 2013 in 6 London boroughs and included a number of communication techniques such as the infamous go-home vans. We have Operation Nexus, which was about more effectively tackling offending by foreign nationals through close working and smarter use of police and immigration interventions. This led to the Home Office being embedded in police custody suites, so anyone engaging with the police would, quite rightly so, feel afraid about what is happening to them and how this information may be used. Even if they're a victim, would it be used against them? This affected people who are homeless, people who were victims of crime, and a large number of East European migrants who were not reporting crimes because they were fearful of the police. And then we have Operation Skybreaker, which again presented as a new way to work with engagement with local communities. So the Home Office sought to and succeeded in penetrating local faith organisations, hosting outreach surgeries with the intention of asking faith groups to report people with immigration problems. But what this has done is closed down opportunities for people who do have concerns to feel safe. And this involved a number of heavy-handed tactics, including raids, working with children's services, housing departments, local authorities. So this was about embedding Home Office officers within their teams, but also tracking intelligence and widening the pool of people who may be caught through immigration enforcement. So what about pushing back? How do we respond to these practices that are built around information criminalisation and collaboration? I'd like you to pause here and select one campaign, either Docs Not Cops, focusing on health, Against Borders for Children, on education, or the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, on housing and the right to rent. And I'd like you to just visit their websites and think, what are the key messages coming from these organisations who are trying to offer a pushback against everyday bordering practice and the technologies of everyday bordering? And think about whether these are indeed effective ways of challenging these technologies. Can you make connections to Doma politics here? What about questions around racism and anti-racist practice? And can these actions contribute to the unmaking of the migrant? So what we've covered so far, and what you'll have covered in the readings, is this idea that bordering is multidimensional and multifaceted. It is uneven and differentiated. It is hidden, but at the same time extremely visible. We've seen how it's hierarchical and boundaried, it's physical and symbolic, it's exceptional and routine, and it's also present on our doorstep, but also controlled remotely. And I'd like you to think of an example of an everyday physical and/or symbolic bordering that you're happy to share in class. And this can be from personal experience, if you're happy to do that, or your reflections on some other practice or a current event. And I'd like you to prepare a very short case study that actually describes this example briefly and reflects on how you connect this example to the readings and the literature and the debates around everyday bordering. So looking at how we might apply these theoretical ideas to real life. And in doing so, I'd like you to also think about how we might evaluate the effectiveness of these concepts and how we think through experiences of migration and how we think sociologically through these experiences. So, to sum up, there are different ways of understanding what we mean by the border and bordering. If we think of it as an active verb, that suggests that it's something that is ongoing, that there are people who are responsible for the doing of the border. We think of it as an active process, something that involves different parties and that is ongoing. It is interactional and it is performed in multiple spheres and on multiple levels. And actually this all comes to suggest more or less the same thing, that borders are something which shapes social reality and they select and prioritise social relations. And inherent in this is this question of power. Who are the groups in society who desire borders? What are the decision-making processes which enable certain groups to make these decisions? Who undertakes border implementation and who resists? And I think this brings us back full circle to this discussion at the start of the ways in which borders are now described and enacted by both the state and civil society. And an important point here is the perception of bordering as a management mechanism. And if you think back to the Everyday Bordering film, the language we use takes us well beyond traditional descriptions of the territorial boundary making and marking and into the much more complex and murkier space of social interaction. So we've overcome a spatial fixation and we've refocused on the social. But perhaps another important question here is, to what extent do borders function as barriers to movement and interaction? Or can they also be an interface where meeting places and points of contact are created? And this takes us to resistance. Are we only able to become border guards, or are there other ways to engage in bordering activities? You're going to explore some of that when you look at the campaigns in the other slide, Docs Not Cops, against Borders for Children and the JCWI. And we'll also look at that in next week's class when we look at migrant resistance. So thanks very much. And I'd like you to really reflect here on the readings and how you bring the theoretical ideas into conversation with these examples of everyday practice of bordering.